Good afternoon, everyone. Segun, Sewagwegun, as we would say in our language. I first want to acknowledge the Shakopee, Metawankaton First Nation peoples for welcoming us here and for greeting us and hosting us on their territory. I'll introduce myself, and Kaylia will do the same. My name is Treena Wasundio Delormier. I am from the Kahnawake community, and we'll show you where it is located on a map. I'm currently assistant professor at the University of Hawaii, where we have a Master's of Public Health program in Native Hawaiian and Indigenous Health. So I'm one of the two faculty, along with my Leitauali'i over there, who are delivering that program. But I'm also involved with the Kahnawake Schools Diabetes Prevention Project, which I've been involved with for the last 24 years or so. I'm also a mom. I have two children, a son who's going to be 20 soon, I can't believe that, and my daughter who's a senior in high school. So, and I'm also a dietitian. I'll turn it over to Kaylia.
Hi, Gwe. I'm Aianóhon Kaylia Marquis. I'm also from Kahnawake. I'm currently acting as the project coordinator for Ieiénthos Akotióhkwa, which is a planting group that we have in the community. I also coordinate projects for Wahoni Zaitoni Ohtune, which is a grassroots organization that looks at early child care in the community, and they have a lot of overlapping priorities. I think that's about it. I'm currently also a community advisory board member for the Kahnawake Schools Diabetes Prevention Project, so I have a toe in a lot of these pools. You're a mom. Oh yeah, I'm also a mom. I love them very much, my first priority.
Okay, so just to give you some perspective of where we're talking about in the North American or Turtle Island context, you see in the red circle, that's where our community is about located. And then on this map of Quebec showing all of the First Nation communities, we're located just here, on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River near Montreal, Quebec in Canada. And we call ourselves Kanienkaháka. People also know us as Mohawk, and the Mohawk Nation is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Kahnawake means by the rapids. So the whole approach that we wanted to share with you today, and what we feel we've been working on and want to work on continuously into the future, is this idea of building relationships as our way of approaching food security and food sovereignty and well-being. And this is a foundational way of thinking for Umwehumwe, for Indigenous people. And we have an opening prayer that we say, our opening words we say before every important gathering called the Hontagardi Wadekwa, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But within that, we see how our place in all of creation and how that's very relational. We understand this to be a basis for what makes a strong society, and we also believe this is the strong basis for collaborating to make positive change in our communities. And it's also what we find in public health, and a lot of the public health approaches nowadays is importance of collaboration. And I was trained in public health at the PhD level in health promotion, and we learned there the value of community and getting community engagement. But these things are already the way we do things in our community when we're following our instructions and keeping up our responsibilities.
So Ieiénthos Akotióhkwa is a literal translation of a planting group. It was developed 4 or 5 years ago when Treena brought together a bunch of different people from different organizations in the community that we felt had some overlapping priorities in this direction. We grouped together a lot of diverse interests around food and health. Treena had done some research in the community that suggested that food insecurity was being experienced by Kahnawake families, which I'm not sure was explicitly understood anyway in the community. We accessed some funding through Health Canada's Aboriginal Diabetes Initiative, and they had just come out with a fund looking at food security, so it was very timely in that way. The Kahnawake Environment Protection Office was another organization that we identified as having very similar priorities, and we've been working closely with them from that time to see what gaps or what areas we want to address. The group consists of other community members and community advisory board members for the Kahnawake Diabetes Prevention Project. And we really just thought of, in an ideal situation, what would we like to see and what do we think would be well received in the community.
Okay, and just I wanted to give a little background and history to the current work that we're doing. It starts with, well, for me, it's significant that it starts with the Kahnawake Schools Diabetes Prevention Project, which is a community university partnership. We heard a lot about the importance of partnership this morning, and that we established in 1994. And it was really because of research that was done in the community documenting the high prevalence of type 2 diabetes and the high rates of complications. When that research came back, the community said, well, can we do something about complications or can we prevent this? And they said, well, we can prevent it. You know, that was actually a new idea at that time, looking at prevention of type 2 diabetes at a population level. And the community said, well, we want to do that with our children. We don't want to know more about complications and do that research. Let's do primary prevention. So that's what the beginnings of KSDPP was. I'll present a little bit of research from there a little bit later, but what KSDPP today is focusing on is less on evaluating interventions for lifestyle and changing lifestyle with children. We do research, we're continuing intervention, but we also focus on sharing that information, so dissemination, and also training, so sharing community mobilization, sharing what we've learned from our experiences because people ask us to and we have the responsibility to share. But also in this partnership, I think to date we have trained 25 master's, PhD, and postdoc students, so almost one a year, because that's the idea, is to build capacity and allow students to come in, both Indigenous and allied researchers, to learn within our space, anything from health research, community health research, nutrition, etc. And we have, this is a grassroots effort. It's to build local community and support healthy lifestyles. We also have two groups that are important in the governing structure: a community advisory board, which Kaylia and I are both members, and research team, which we both can go to, and I'm also a research team member. So our governance structure is built on a consensus decision-making model, which is based on our traditional ways of knowing and doing. And the way it's set up is we have this doesn't have a pointer, okay, we have researchers, we have a community advisory board, which I just mentioned, who work together and inform each other, each with our knowledge, to come up with the best research for our community and to do it in respectful ways. And here's some photos of our advisory board. That dark one is dark because one of our PhD students is presenting her proposal to the community advisory board, where the community advisory board has the opportunity to ask questions, suggest changes. And this comes after many meetings where we get to know the student researcher, especially if they're not from our community. And within that community vision for the overall project, we created that with the community because we felt it was important that we all shared a vision of what we were trying to do for diabetes prevention. And I've highlighted in purple where we really are talking about the importance of relationships in building this diabetes-free future, but also that we had been talking about the importance of food security, food sovereignty, being able to produce our own food that we know is so important for health in our community. So part of the research we did in KSDPP was nutrition research, and I felt it was appropriate because we're at a nutrition conference, and also to highlight how we've used that research to inform action. So when the project first began, we had to collect some baseline data because we did do an intervention and evaluation. And one of the studies that was done was a dietary intake study. And you'll see in that table where the top 3 food sources for energy, protein, carbohydrate, and fat. Sounds like a real nutrition meeting now, right? were determined, and you see the percentage of the total nutrient that was contributed by there. And you can see that ground beef and French fries factor in quite importantly in this list. But we did realize when we're looking at this that none of our traditional foods were in these top lists. We also realized that only 17% of the recalls included cornbread, of which you'll see a little picture there, and that's a traditional food we still consume today, mostly with corn that's purchased. And none of the recalls included squash, which is a traditional food of ours. So that sort of got the intervention team thinking, well, we need to promote these foods. Not so much focus on, the French fries, we were doing that in other ways, but to really promote these foods in many, many ways. So working at an individual level, in the classrooms, having people tasting squash all over the community, and it was like squash, squash, squash until everybody knew what it looked like and what it tasted like. And now we see that it actually is, kind of normal to have that in our foods. 24 years later. It happened before that. So then there was a follow-up study. So there was another dietary intake study done in 1998, and I'm not going to go through this whole table of numbers. What I was trying to just highlight with the yellow numbers is that was comparing the percentage of consumers between 1994 and 1998. So we looked at how many children who were consuming those foods and how it changed. And what we saw was that that was interesting was that, for example, whole milk, the number of children who drank whole milk actually decreased. It was significantly decreased. And the amount that was being consumed by those who did consume milk actually increased. So the consumers of whole milk were actually consuming a lot more whole milk than the children from 1994. And there was also some complex intake patterns around sugar-sweetened beverages, which led the researchers to look more carefully at those kind of juices like powdered drinks that are just sugar, and then those fruit drinks that have just like 10% of fruit drinks, and then the ones that have more fruit. So those were kind of shifting and changing along with like colas, and it seemed like the consumption of cola, which is, over here, the amount actually decreased. In the red numbers, we're looking at amounts, and that was significant. But there were certain other things happening. And overall, what it meant is that we had to pay more attention to let parents know that it's tricky when you're choosing these drinks. And actually, instead of doing a lot of education around sugar, we did do that, like showing how much sugar is in drinks. We really strongly promoted water. And like, if you're going to have an event, just have water. So we became actually a supplier of water for a long time, and now we have to sort of change that and say, well, get your own water now. We no longer like kind of subsidize water at events. KSDPP as a project can't do that anyway. And then, so what happened overall? Were we able to show, because ultimately we wanted to prevent type 2 diabetes by working at the level, our focus was school children, but of course, understanding that children are in schools, and then children are in their families, and then this is all in our community. So after that whole ecological intervention, what happened? Did we see a decrease in the BMI, in the obesity levels with the children? And what you see here, for those of you who are familiar or comfortable with odds ratios, is this is our reference year when the project started in 1994. So we're comparing subsequent years and the risk of being at an increased BMI in later years. So what we find here is that in 2002, students were at a significantly higher risk of having a higher BMI and a decreased risk, that's what these other statistics are, for consuming key sugar foods, which is a good thing, key fat foods, they were eating less of that, but also fruit and vegetables, and that might be due to fruit juice consumption being decreased. It's not that easy always to determine this thing from nutrition data, but it might seem like you could say, and what did you say? Like it didn't work, so what did you do to them? They got heavier. But it was, we looked at these results. We had a lot of conversations with the community. We actually brought these results to every organization in our community to say, this is what we found out after all of, 8 years. We find that our kids are at higher risk for higher BMI than when we started the project. But, we had to look at that within a context of secular trends, and that had been the case for all of children in Canada. BMI rates had been increasing. So, our project might have done something to sort of decrease the rate of increase. We don't know that because we only had a comparison community for the first 3 years of the intervention, and then that community started their own diabetes prevention project. But people had insights, like that's when we had cable television in all of the homes, which we didn't have when the project started, and different sort of insights around what was going on there. But we did realize that we had created this norm that diabetes is preventable, that you could do many things to promote well-being, and that what we're doing needs to continue, and that we need to think of different ways of doing it. So I think that's sort of the impetus for where our projects have gone from then. And in our approaches then, so it's like we use this model of intervention that was evidence-based and had been modeled after cardiovascular disease prevention projects with youth in the U.S. primarily. And this is what we found out. So we did always have that approach of using our governance structures to guide our model, make sure that interventions were going to work in our community by having our intervention workers be from our community and be very well-known and credible in the community. We all know that's really important. But then we also started to, some of us really think about, well, what are our traditional teachings, the indigenous knowledge that we have where, we know that if we follow that, we have good direction for what to do next. And Ahondagari Wadekwa, like I said, means the words that come before all else. And in those words that are recited at the beginning of a gathering, we acknowledge all of creation and each role of every living thing and thing in creation. But we also acknowledge our place as Ngwehunwe, to those beings. And it reminds us that things are connected and that interdependence within, our place in creation. And also that we have, like all living things, we have a responsibility to take care and respect nature, and then it in turn will take care of us. I'm going to turn over to Kaylia to continue talking about the cycle of ceremonies.
So the Haudenosaunee people have an annual cycle of ceremonies, which is often used as a calendar for the year. It outlines our traditional responsibilities, our ceremonies, and our festivals. But if you look at each of the events that occur over the year, they're centered around farming and food. And they also rely on the moon cycles and the natural world for timing, which means we can't just schedule it 3 years in advance and say, we know it's December 25th, that special event, so set up your school dates. Instead, we have to have awkward times off from school and overlapping times, and no one knows what's happening until the strawberries come out. So when we look at the annual cycle of ceremonies, it becomes evident then that our community's survival historically was dependent on the environment around us, the foods that were available, and our roles and responsibilities towards those foods are expressed through these ceremonies and festivals. Usually, the most of what we're doing is preparing our seeds, planting, harvesting, storing, like braiding your corn, and it's all about giving thanks to what was given to you from your environment and acknowledging your space within it instead of apart from it. So I think this is just a really good example to show that from time immemorial, we recognized our place and our connection to our environment, and we respected our role in taking care of those foods and using them in the way they were meant to be. So our projects began looking at food security and food sovereignty as a way to prevent type 2 diabetes, but also to address a lot of other concerns, a lot of other health concerns in the community. We have a Wampum Belt, which represents a one bowl, one spoon concept. The idea there, I find it so fitting that the imagery is a bowl and a spoon to represent that resources are shared amongst all of the people and that we have a responsibility to make sure that everyone is fed and cared for. In a lot of ways, it looks at the communal aspect of land management so that there's always land to grow the food that you need, there's space for your firewood, there's room outside of your communities for hunting, that hunting lands are respected between nations. But we understood from the outset that it was related to food and survival. So I just think that it's really fitting that our current approaches to community building, to collaboration, to improving the health and well-being of our communities are coming right back to this belt, which is hundreds of years old. We looked at how are we actually building relationships between food security and food sovereignty. And what we're finding from all of the interventions that we've put in place is that different priorities are bringing different community members to the table. So networks are being expanded apart from people's usual comfort zones. So we have people that come to our events that are interested in organic food, traditional food, non-GMO, heirloom foods. We have people who have a lot of experience as home gardeners or farmers, elderly people who were farmers as children. We have people who are survivalists and are trying to survive the coming zombie apocalypse. We have people who are canners, who've been canning their whole lives, who learned from their grandmothers and mothers. We have low-income households who don't care about any of that and just want to save money. We have people who support self-sufficiency for political, environmental, or other reasons. People who want to make sure that as a community we can actually have a legitimate claim to self-sufficiency because we can actually feed our people from our communities. Our community is quite small. It's about 13,000 acres, so feeding a community of 8,000 people with 13,000 acres is a bit of a challenge. The people who come to the table, we have people who are traditionally agricultural families who are rubbing elbows now with young parents and youth who are actually looking to learn traditional ways or transmit that traditional knowledge to their children. We have formal organizations coming to the table agreeing that some of our priorities and goals overlap with theirs and they'd like to help us support these interventions. And that's a lot of relationship building as well over time. I don't know how it is in any of your communities, but for a lot of our community, it's a little bit of a wait-and-see attitude, like, yeah, they're trying this, we'll see how it goes. And then maybe a year or two later, they're like, oh, I actually heard about this from 2 other sources, so I guess you're doing something, so maybe we can work together. So at the outset, we have to approach it in a very open way. I find one of the things that works a lot is to give credit for every bit of cooperation you get from anyone. If someone tells you that they'll let you use their space, acknowledge that on the posters. If someone lets you borrow a projector for a presentation, acknowledge it. And I think something that's worked for me anyway is to really emphasize that I'm not in it to gain credit, or that our organization isn't there to gain credit for this intervention, that we all share the common goal of improving food security and food sovereignty within the community. We also find a lot of lower income households are getting to have more personal relationships with people that they may not have typically. Like if there's an executive director for an organization that this person has some association with, they now have a reason to talk to that person that doesn't have the intimidation factor of asking to speak to the executive director. Instead, you're like, yeah, we canned some tomatoes last week, how's it going? So I think that's a really good way to help ease the stratification between different socioeconomic classes in the community. And we've also found that other organizations are interested in being involved that perhaps we wouldn't have initially identified, such as the library or the United Church Hall, which we use for venues. So whenever we talk about setting up anything, usually the people we talk to are from the community, and they're like, oh, that's so interesting. You know, my aunt does that, or I have a neighbor who does that. I'm going to tell her about this. So we end up expanding our network sort of organically in that way, just by discussing it on a regular basis. One thing we found for building relationships is that food security is kind of an easy sell, you know, like it's not controversial. No one's really going to disagree that we should feed our children well, that we should care for future generations, that we should eat traditional foods. It's an easy sell. So for people who perhaps don't have a lot of traditional knowledge, this is a less intimidating way for them to become better acquainted with it. We present it in a not judgmental or threatening way. We're not telling you, well, you should already know this. We're saying this is information that not everyone has had a chance to be exposed to, and we're finding people who are willing to share it. And if you have stories, come by and share them. And I find for a lot of the less formal talks, it's really just a space to get people in the room. There might be a few words said at the beginning, but the end result is really sharing the stories between the people, laughing and creating relationships that may not have occurred even or been fostered in this way. So food security research. One of the first things we did in the community was to do an environmental scan of food security research in Kahnawake, but I think I'll pass this to Treena because she was the lead researcher for this.
And I just wanted to, quickly go through some of the research projects we did without going into a lot of detail of the, the design and the findings, just to show you that we have come sort of like, because of our partnership, kind of savvy on how to be able to use research. That's, we came up with our own scan because we looked and we didn't find one. We used like concepts from food security. And because I'm a researcher from the community now, it's my responsibility to provide guidance on that. And I think that we have a nice sort of mix between doing some research and then using the findings for our work. And so this helped us to understand, for example, that we thought a lot of the health and social services programs in our community, and we're lucky to have many of them, were addressing food security, usually by giving programs that address how to prepare food, offering meals. But we also realized that there's quite a centralized food bank, which we haven't had until just recently in our community, and we started to have discussions now, like, what does that mean that we have this organized food bank that's providing 80 families every month with a basket, and that charities now give to that food bank, whereas before it was kind of, here and there. It's become very centralized and organized. So is that a good thing, or what is that telling us about our social relationships? So, and also, like, we have gaps in our transportation. We don't have public transportation. It's very difficult for people without a personal vehicle to go to a grocery store. For elders who are in like a long-term care, they can go out and go shopping, but we need to sort of look at those sorts of things. So that was the importance of the scan. And that discussion around the food bank actually sort of became this other project that I'm doing with the International Union for Nutrition Sciences. Harriet Kuhnlein will probably talk about it tomorrow. A few case studies looking at how does gender, matrilineal societies, how does that impact food security with Indigenous groups in different places around the world. And we're looking in our community at Haudenosaunee responsibilities and practices for food security can guide our future approaches. And we're talking to people from our community who are very knowledgeable about this to get their insights on what the future of our next steps would look like. Here's just some pictures from our meeting last summer, and we just had one recently in August. And you see Kaylia there with her baby who was just...
I'm a mom. I don't know, he was 6 months old maybe?
Yeah.
That was last year, right?
Yeah, and we have, this is an elder from our community. Gahani's a cultural anthropologist and an assistant professor herself. Daige Alfred, who's a political science professor. So we have our research and community members. We're all actually community members in this project. And then I'll let Kaylia talk about this because she's actually coordinating this research project.
Right. So I'm the community coordinator right now for the First Nations Food, Nutrition, and Environment Study. This study is across Canada. There are 10 provinces and territories in Canada, and Quebec is the 10th and last province to be looking at this. So they're actually looking at getting information on what our diets look like, how much traditional food is actually making it into our diets, and also looking at exposure to contaminants to that end. So we're doing water sampling as well, and we're collecting traditional foods to see what types of contaminants and toxins are showing up in there. So this is just launched this fall, but it should be done by the end of this year. And it's really, I think, a good indicator to show that our community is interested in that direction. Treena spoke earlier about doing a baseline data survey on what traditional food consumption looked like in our community, and we're finding now that people are definitely aware of what foods are traditional. They have sources to get traditional food into the community, and there's interest in learning more about this, which I'm not sure would have been the case many, many years ago. But now we even have an existing study to look at, so we can compare back and see how far we've come. So in terms of food security projects, so this is the area I work on most. So we have farmers markets set up. It's been the last 2 or 3 years. I find that the farmers markets are a really good opportunity for people to get together and a good opportunity for community members to access foods that perhaps they wouldn't typically have access to. If it's not a neighbor or a relative, you might feel a little bit awkward about knocking on someone's door and being like, I heard you have this growing in your yard, can I have it? But in this case, a lot of times the gardeners and the food producers who come are like, just let me know, call me, and it creates a little bit of that connection. So people who may not have felt confident in asking for, when you slaughter your beef cows, you going to have any extra meat left? Or I heard you keep chickens, or whatever the case may be. It's not all traditional foods, but they're all definitely local. So we want to encourage those systems within the community instead of having money leave the community or forcing people to leave the community to access healthy food, fresh food. So here are just some people who brought some fruits and vegetables. It's a bit of a slow start. We have a lot of people coming with crafts sometimes, which is fine. We're encouraging anything that's homemade. If you made it at home, bring it. We put together a seed library, which operates out of our library in the community. So that is actually what it sounds like. You go and check out a packet of seeds as you would books. And at the end of the year, once you've grown that seed, you save some of the seeds and return it back like you would with a book, which helped us realize that not everybody knows how to save seeds. So we're trying to look at this year providing more information and workshops and hands-on experiences for people to say this is how you actually save a seed, or this is how you store a seed properly. This is very well received. The library took off with this. This is one of the library workers took a presentation board and put together information on the background for each of the seeds that had been submitted. Some of them just had like the name and the last year it had been grown, and he had put together a whole list of, where they come from, what nation they come from, who submitted it, everything like that. So what we're looking for is to make sure that these seeds continue to live, and we also want people to talk to their neighbors so they don't cross. So that's the first thing we ask people is if you're borrowing seeds, you need to make sure that there's no one in your immediate vicinity that's growing anything that might cross. This is our 2016 calendar for workshops. The green, I don't know if you can actually see that well, but the green Sundays are our farmers markets. The yellow Wednesdays is our Wednesday night workshop series. We had a few workshops in the beginning of the year. There are quite a few different types of workshops that we've been offering, mostly centered around food, garden preparation and care, harvesting, food preparation, and food preservation. So we've been trying to focus a lot on preserving a bountiful harvest because in our area we have winter like 11 months a year. It's not true, maybe 6 or 7 months, but nothing's growing for those first couple of months when it's not winter. So we want to make sure that when food is inexpensive and people can access it in a financial sense, that they do it and they're able to preserve it properly so that their family can enjoy more healthful local food for the remainder of the year. This year we're putting together an white oak workshop where we're processing white oak nuts, acorns, into nut butters, into flour. This is a viable protein that is traditionally available in our diets from time immemorial, but no one really uses them, and not everyone is aware that it's actually a food source. So we're doing a workshop on how to prepare them because they are poisonous if you just eat them. So don't do it at home. Learn about it a little bit. And then the following week, we're doing a squash workshop to look, because it's the week before Halloween, so people are going to be going out, getting pumpkins, potentially buying or accessing other squash from other sources. So we want to say, like, well, you can make flour with squash and put that in your breads, and it's a bit of a more healthful source than getting white refined flour. But the week after that, we're doing food preservation through pressure canning. So we have a hunter who's giving us traditional, traditionally caught, I guess, meat, and then we have a subsistence fisherman who's supplying fish, and then we have a community member showing people how to do pressure canning. We also had someone offer to do pasta making, which is not traditional, but if we use the acorn flour and the squash flour, we are having a much more sustainable local opportunity to incorporate that into dishes we may already be familiar with. We also did a tomato canning workshop earlier in the year, so I'm going to throw them all together and see what happens. We have a Health and Harvest Fair on October 23rd, which is the opportunity for other farmers and people who do food preservation to come in and sell what they create, because we need to acknowledge for food security that it's not just you have the food. People also need financial support. So we give them the opportunity there, and to also share information of what they've been up to and give us feedback on what they want to see. November 23rd of this year, we're actually doing an evaluation of our last 4 years programming to see what people have liked, what they didn't know about, what they're familiar with, and what we also want to do a consultation to see what exactly do they feel that we're not addressing, or what do they want us to prioritize. So food cultivation, garden planning, pest control, composting, crop sharing, seed exchanges, season extension. We have other offerings from other departments and organizations, so we try to work closely with them. Either we stagger what we offer or we collaborate on one. We do edible landscape walks. We do food forest walks, dandelions. We made a salad dressing with them. Did you know dandelions? We do medicinal walks, and there are a lot of other groups that are interested in these areas, so sometimes we just tack on with them and make sure to publicize them and do the legwork in that way that an organization might not have time to do. We do cooking classes that incorporate language. We wash our corn in our traditional way, and then we do food preservation. So here's a few pictures. Strawberry jam, there was a seed exchange right there, and the other one, I think that's tomato canning. That was just this year, the top right. We accessed some funding this year as well to cultivate an edible landscape in our community. We exist in an area that has the potential to provide us with all of our food through food forests. So we asked a local arborist, Chuck Barnett, to cultivate 3 different types of traditional edibles per year to give away for 5 years. So he's on the job. Part of the project is to put together an almanac of how he cultivates those trees, and he's doing a workshop on fruit tree propagation as well, because there's some work in the fall and some in the spring. And we're asking neighborhoods to agree to co-plant different types of edibles. We live in a very small community. A lot of people live on a 1/4 acre lot, so that's why it's important to talk to your neighbors about what you're growing. But we're also saying you don't have enough room to grow only what your family will need. So you need to talk to your neighbors and say, listen, I'll plant this type of food, you plant that type of food, you plant that type of food, and we're all feeding ourselves within walking distance. Another part of that, an extension of that, was to look at creating a food map of existing edibles that are already mature in our community, because there are some on private land that the people, take it, it's just going to attract bees, they want you to take it. But if we could have a Google Maps overlay, let's say, and we know what season they're coming in, we're going to our walk. We actually talked to our community about putting some black walnut trees on public property, and he was suggesting that we put a forest of nut trees so that it would be the season to go gathering nuts in that area of the community. So we're looking at that. To that end, we've been pursuing a formal arrangement to local government to make sure that new areas that are opened up for housing, let's say, or are developed in some way, have a commitment to including edibles into the landscape. We want to make it an everyday thing so that it's not unusual to say, I'm hungry, so I had to go pick weeds, but instead you're like, can you believe I have this awesome dandelion dressing? Because that's the way it used to be, and that's the way it should be. This funding was provided by Toronto Dominion Bank, and when they presented us with our enormous check, they mentioned that this was the only proposal they received in the country that approached this in terms of a project perspective, instead of saying, just give us money, we'll plant some trees. Instead, there was some thought, I guess, to sustainability and capacity building. And our family garden project, I think, is a great place to wind it down a little bit. We've been doing this for the last few years. It's basically we hire a summer student to help families get their kids in the garden early. So a lot of, if anyone here has young kids, taking a child into a garden where you want them both to survive can be a bit of a challenge. And we recognize that, so we hire a summer student to help either with the gardening or wrangling your children to make sure you get some time out there to start building that capacity at home and sharing that knowledge with your children. One thing that I found talking to older gardeners is all of them say, I hated it when I was a kid, but oh, I'm so happy I know how to do it now. So we can't just, while my kid is bored after 10 minutes, so we don't learn that. It's something we need to support families in sharing that information with their children, because we don't have the same parenting landscape that we did 2 or 3 generations ago. And I love to say that this project it's all gold, right? Like you're outside, you're away from screens, you're spending time with your kids are eating fresh produce, probably because they grew it. They wouldn't try it if you just gave it to them. They have pride, you're building capacity, it's just, everything's gold. Everything's gold. The thing that we found is keeping young families committed can be difficult because everyone is busy. So what we've tried to impress upon people is that it's not supposed to be stressful for you to go into the garden. And if you keep up with it long enough, you'll actually find that being in the garden helps to reduce your stress in other arenas of your life. So one of KSDPP's guiding principles, its guiding principle, is to look at healthy diet, exercise, and a positive attitude. And that can be difficult to cultivate, be positive. But if we can say this activity is something that you may find brings you a certain level of peace or security, and it's going to spill over into other areas of your life, then that's what we'll do. For this, we also we do evaluations each year, but we need to look at year to year how it's working for everyone and how we can improve it, make it more efficient, and hopefully make it sustainable, so that we have a neighbor who's done the project and we say, why don't you talk to your neighbor across the street because she mentioned she might be interested. Could you act as her support system and keep it going in that way? Yeah, all right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.